so much. Hi, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. As you could have guessed from the titles of my books and some of the remarks you heard in the introduction, I make my living by complaining. But every time I come to Central Europe, and especially to Hungary, I feel like there is very tough competition here, as everybody else seems to be stealing my lunch. That said, today I'm not here to complain about robots or technology for the simple reason that I don't think that robots or technology at this point in time can be treated as a singular force that can be analyzed and juxtaposed and compared to humans. In this sense, I very much agree with what we have just heard from Ken. There is definitely a multiplicity out there, technologies, forms of technological organization, machines, information-driven platforms, all of them can take many different forms. Where the skeptic in me starts thinking is when I actually try to think about which of those forms are most probable to be implemented today. And unfortunately, what I see is that not of all of those options that we tend to think of as multiplicity are equally likely. What is most likely to happen is that the companies and the governments who are already far ahead in implementing many of those technologies will get a firm start, and that the technologies and platforms that would favor the interests of citizens, the interests of local communities, the interests of people who want to promote equality and many other social values, they would not have as many chances. And I think it's very important for us to understand what it is that we are complaining about. And here the complaint should not be aimed at technology. It should be aimed at who actually gets to own, operate, manage, and implement those technologies. And the short thesis of my talk, and I will unpack it as we go on, is that unless something very drastic changes, I don't think that we will actually reap all the benefits of those technologies. And to give you an example, just to get us going, if you've recently been to the Philippines and you have had a chance to step into a public bathroom, you might have noticed something very odd happening there. The moment you leave the public bathroom stall, an alarm goes off in the bathroom. And the only way to turn it off is to push the soap dispenser button in the bathroom, clean your hands, and only afterwards the alarm will go off. Right, the idea here, as you can guess, is that the public authorities in the Philippines want to rely on the ability that sensors suddenly give them to monitor human behavior, to push for a healthier, more sanitary, and probably saner world. That's at least how they present it. The company that has installed all those sensors in the bathrooms is Procter & Gamble, and I think we have two options here. We can either start complaining about the intrusion of technologies and sensors into our everyday life, which is an approach taken by many critics of technology, or we can actually start analyzing what it is that's pushing governments and companies who open, cooperate, and work in tandem to actually deploy all of those technologies to govern how we live, and to govern our behavior, and to live us with fewer and fewer choices, and to engage in very sly and often invisible manipulation of how we live, consume, and organize. And I think the second route of analyzing this cooperation that currently exists between governments and companies is much more fruitful because it's much more likely to lead to any kind of social change. We cannot just stick to a very conservative critique of technology and continue arguing that as technology invades our lives, we have to basically go and hide from it and live in the forest, disconnected from the plug and being completely on our own. I think that critique misses quite a lot, but what's actually good about technology. But this is why I think we have to be very careful. If you look at some of the most powerful critique that has emerged with regards to social media, if you look at all of these people complaining about Twitter and Facebook and social media platforms in general, right? I think that what they're missing is a very deep understanding of the political economy and the business model of those firms. What you get with a company like Facebook or Twitter is the need to constantly make you click on ads. Why is this happening? It's happening, not on ads, but click in general on the site, on various links. Why is this happening? Because the more clicks you make on that platform in a minute, the more the platform knows about you, and the more valuable you become to the advertiser. Thus, the entire design of the system and of the platform is geared towards distracting you, because the platform itself wants to distract you from actually engaging in meaningful communication and to push you much more aggressively towards clicking on updates, clicking on new and new materials and new and new information coming into the site so that the site can learn more about you and then sell you to the advertiser. Right? And this is why I think we can clearly see how a human need, and I would argue that the need to communicate is a deeply ingrained human desire, and there is nothing unnatural about us wanting to communicate, particularly with people who live far away and who we cannot reach otherwise, through technology. The problem is, right now, that technology is not at all under our control. It's under the control of many of these firms, and these firms at this point do whatever they want to make us profitable to them. And very often, of course, it has all of these negative side effects. We suddenly become distracted, we feel stress, we develop all sorts of psychic disorders, and there is more and more research showing how addicted we become to many of those platforms. But again, this is not happening by accident. This is happening because these platforms are designed that way. Very much like junk food is designed to make you addicted to it. Right? There are very smart manufacturers of junk food, and that's a trade that has been honed for many decades, which add certain ingredients, which make it appeal to certain deep psychic elements, which make you consume and want it even more. And I would argue we have to be as critical and skeptical of the way in which technology companies operate as well. Because if we aren't, we are likely to be the losers. We, the users, the citizens. Right? And this is where I think we have to try to imagine a world beyond Silicon Valley. Because if we cannot imagine a highly technological world that exists, runs, and operates outside of control of these data-driven companies, who, by the way, are more than happy to often share some of the data with the governments, which need it for national security purposes and other reasons, we are going to end up surrendering more and more of our traditional ways of handling problems to Silicon Valley and technology companies more broadly. I think we have to tackle this issue head on because in Europe, we have not yet grasped what's happening. But I think if you look at America, it's quite clear that within 5 or 10 years, a company like Google, a company like Apple, and a company like Facebook would want to do far many more things than just advertising. They would want to be the provider of healthcare. They would want to be the provider of education. Very often, they would want to be the provider of energy in your house. And if you look at the expansion of Google and Apple over the last few years, all of that will be confirmed. You'll see them expanding into your house. They want to have sensors that will monitor your energy use through smart thermostats. You'll see them expanding into your phones to monitor how much exercise and how much physical activity you do, what you eat, how much actually you're likely to have a heart attack, for example. Right now, with wearable technologies, all of that is possible. We can actually monitor, predict that, and thus shape your behavior. You can also look at self-driving cars. I mean, the way in which these companies are developing, and robotics, of course, plays a very important role in it, but I would also argue the collection of data about our everyday behavior plays an even more important role in it, positions this sector and technology companies especially as the provider of welfare services that we previously expected to be provided from other means. Right? We would not think that a company like Apple or a company like Google will be the provider of healthcare services. Yet, as our governments are running out of cash and are looking for innovative solutions, suddenly a company like Apple, which does have the means to monitor our everyday behavior and alert us that we need to exercise more, we need to move more, we need to change our diet, suddenly become very powerful allies to the governments, and one day they might actually replace them. Right? Because they can actually analyze this data and adjust and nudge our behavior much more effectively and much faster than most regulators. And this is the moment at which Silicon Valley does begin to disrupt, if you will, the regulators and the traditional governments. And that moment has not yet been fully understood, I would argue, by the regulators themselves. And this puts us in a very uncomfortable situation because the way in which Silicon Valley, based on data, sensors, and technological architecture, tackles problems is very different from the conventional way in which we used to tackle them. All the weight, all the responsibility for doing something about your health, about your education is placed on you, right? It's no longer the kind of socialized model where we all share the risks or falling sick, and you would pay as much as your neighbor did in your insurance because you didn't know how likely that you would get into a car accident and how likely that your neighbor will fall into a car accident, right? There was some kind of solidarity underwriting our social relations, which is slowly falling apart as we can collect more data about ourselves, but also about our neighbors, right? Once you know that you are much healthier than many of the people in your social circle, it becomes much harder to justify why it is that you should actually be subsidizing the lifestyle, right? And this is where the ability to monitor our behavior and to translate it into quantifiable terms does lead to a very disturbing world whereby all of us will probably end up paying and bearing very different costs for the services that we previously expected to be provided on more equitable terms. Right? And this is where I think we really have to understand the new grounds for discrimination that will arise as we shift towards this data-centric models. Right? But I would also argue that we have to try to understand what are the key layers that we as citizens need to control in order to be able to articulate an alternative. If you look at, for example, public transportation, the vision of Silicon Valley is clear. It's either going to be Uber, which in a very personalized manner will dispatch a car to pick us up and to deliver us to where we need to go, or it's going to be some kind of a Google-provided self-driving car that will probably fetch people and drive them around again, perhaps even for free, as long as you are willing to let it monitor everything that you do and surrender the rest of your data. That's the model that Silicon Valley provides for everything, right? Its services will be free, in a sense, and you'll get them. Right? And you'll be able to get them in a way that you previously couldn't. And this is why I think Silicon Valley and technology companies more broadly that operate with data do have a very strong and attractive pitch to many governments and many citizens. When the governments can no longer provide many of those services, Silicon Valley comes in and says, give us your data, we'll give you the services. Right? And I think this is essentially their pitch. The problem with this model is that, of course, it leads to all sorts of other disturbances and discriminations and whatnot. If you think about Uber, that being a private company, of course, they want to lower their costs. So what do they expect of you? They expect to rank you as a passenger, right? So every passenger now has to acquire a reputation. All of you have to be ranked by the drivers based on what drivers think about you. So if the driver finds that your joke is not funny, or that your sandwich that you're eating in the car smells in a way that he doesn't like, you'll get very poor marks. And if he does, you'll get very good marks. And this, I would argue, actually is a good indicator of how an information-driven, completely privately owned and operated economy would function. We'll all have to start worrying about our reputations in the marketplace, which basically means that we'll all be in the marketplace. It's a transformation of a model that used to be driven by some kind of public social logic into a completely privatized logic where we're all just consumers for services in the marketplace. So we have to worry about how we're going to look to our transportation service providers, our healthcare service providers, our education service providers. It's like if you took the logic of the mortgage and the logic of the credit score, according by which you are supposed to be judged by the bank, and try to universalize it into all the other domains. This, I would argue, is what's going to happen when Silicon Valley firmly establishes itself as the intermediaries through which all the services will be delivered. I'm not at all sure that you would be able to get an insurance package that you can get now once your insurance company has the ability to understand your lifestyle in a way that they couldn't understand before. Once they know that you like to drink coffee in the morning, clearly your risk of a heart attack might go up or might not go up, right? And you'll have to start thinking whether you actually want to have that coffee or not, if that's going to result in higher insurance premium payments, right? And this, I would argue, is a profound transformation of not just how we get those services, but also how we think about each other and how we think about the state, how we think about welfare, how we think about public welfare, right? And the amount of discrimination that will happen because of these transformations, I think, has not been fully understood. In part because the people who are early adopters of those technologies in Silicon Valley, and if you look at places like Berlin or London as the two hubs that are obsessed with these technologies in Europe, they all happen to be well off already. So they don't really have anything to fear by being ranked by insurance providers or by drivers or by any other social institution, in part because they're already very healthy, they're already very comfortable, they don't have to worry about getting loans, nor do they have to worry about getting any of the other services. Right? If you have enough money, you don't have to worry about this stuff at all. You don't need to care what your Google search results look like. That's a concern that doesn't happen if you reach a certain level of prosperity. And I would argue that we have not actually seen what's going to happen once this transformation starts touching the other half. Because if you think about it, what has happened is that we have been now promised that once you move from the idea of the average, right, and the average was the norm according to which all the services were priced before. You know, your insurance company would price you based according to some average estimate of people in your cohort. It wouldn't price your insurance coverage based on you specifically. Right? Once you move from the idea of the average toward the idea of a very specific individual, there'll be people who will gain. It means that, you know, if you can show that you are healthier or if you are safer as a driver as the average person in that spreadsheet, of course you'll get some benefits. But what's going to happen to people who are not healthier or who are not safer drivers? Right? They, of course, will have to be, they'll either have to pay more or they'll have to worry much more about what's happening in their life. Right? But the point I was trying to make with public transportation, for example, is that now we have the Uber alternative, privatized public transportation, which is, you know, essentially private transportation taxis, but run in a much more decentralized and effective manner. Some kind of Google-run public transport, which might be self-driving. Where is the third option that will actually bring public transportation as we know it into an electronic age, in an age where everybody carries cell phones and where you can actually run a transportation service in a way that's highly optimized, does not waste resources, and you do not end up in a situation where empty buses go around empty bus stops at 11 in the evening without picking anybody up, and you're wasting a lot of resources, a lot of fuel, and causing a lot of damage to the environment. Like, clearly, there must be a way in which we can deploy sensors, we can deploy technology, we can deploy the ability to understand what's happening in real time to provide a really valuable service that will not just convert a service like public transportation in a privately provided good where we all have to be ranked. Right? If you look at some experiments that have been springing up in this field, you can look, for example, at Finland. There's a very interesting local initiative in Helsinki where they're basically trying to build a modern public transportation system where it does look a little bit like Uber. You all place a request for you know, a car to come and pick you up through a phone. There is an algorithm working somewhere in the cloud which calculates the ideal route for you and other people using the service in the area. And what you get instead is not a privately sent taxi, but actually a minivan which takes you and other passengers, and then with a unique route, it drops you off. So you end up paying €2 or something for a car trip, which would normally cost you, if you took a cab, 10 or 20. Right? To me, it's a very robust transformation of a publicly provided transportation service into still a publicly provided transportation service, but which is very much driven by real-time data collected from the sensors. The problem is that for those kind of local startups to survive, in a climate where the likes of Uber, and Uber at this point is valued at something like $50 billion, right? And we all know the value of Google and the value of Apple. To compete against those firms would be impossible for the sole reason that they very much already control much of the infrastructure that you need to challenge them. Google sits on tons of data, which makes it impossible for any startup to come in and pose a challenge to Google. What Google keeps telling us is that you can just come up with a better algorithm, and the better algorithm will suddenly create another Google. This is just false. Because the reason why Google works so well at this point is its ability to personalize the results that you get, which itself is a function of how well it understands your query, right? And the reason why it understands your query so well is because in my case, for example, Google already sits on 10 years of my searches. It knows where I am, it knows what I want, it knows what I have searched for in the past, and it gives it the ability to predict what kind of information I will need in the future. And I would actually argue that Google has stopped being a search company. Right now it's a prediction company. It basically wants to predict what it is that you would need to know in a second from now, in 10 seconds from now, in a minute from now, in 5 minutes from now. If it can predict that, and I would argue that data that has already accumulated is key to making those predictions, it will be impossible for anybody else to come and outcompete it. Right? And I could argue that you can make the same analysis about Facebook and a few of those other firms, which means that we are basically in an environment where a lot of innovation is not happening, precisely because the environment is so extremely low on competition. It's extremely anti-competitive. These firms are data monopolists. Nobody can actually come and compete with them. And we should start thinking about ways in which we can actually take some of that data and turn it into some kind of a public good on which other entrepreneurs, small companies, activists, NGOs, governments, you name it, can come and start building services. Right? We want to be able to understand what it is that prevents all of us from building a service around the infrastructure that already exists, but currently is only accessible to a handful of companies. And I would argue that if we manage to make that mental switch, we might be able to understand how it is that we can actually have a robust answer to a few giant corporations, because otherwise they will literally end up running many industries that previously have other players in them. There is nothing that makes your insurance company or bank better at predicting how likely you are to have a car accident, or how likely you are to have your house on fire, how likely you are to default on your loan than Google. Because Google has that data and much more. As it starts monitoring what's happening in your house through the Internet of Things and the integration of all the other gadgets, as it starts understanding your car, as many cars switch to Android operating system or become self-driving, there are very few industries that are safe. Right? And I think this is where Europe completely fails to understand the nature of the challenge. Right? I come to Europe a lot, and you talk to policymakers in Brussels, and you understand that their only vision for how to create a robust alternative to Google is to do something like another Google. So they want to build an Airbus to Google's Boeing. Right? And I think that this is a completely flawed analogy, because you're never going to build it at such scale. What you need to do is to take a much smaller, decentralized, guerrilla-like strategy. We need to understand how you can actually have a wealth of startups, a wealth of local initiatives, a wealth of very completely yet unpredicted apps that can be built on top of the data that has already been collected. And that way, I think we'll actually be able to out-compete it. If we don't do that, right, I would argue we will end up with a bunch of these companies dominating many of the fields and positioning themselves as the next welfare state. Because ultimately what they provide right now is a basic form of welfare. They are trying to do their best to achieve mobility, equality, and whatnot. This is at the core of their pitch. If you look at what Facebook right now is doing in the developing world through their Internet.org initiative, this is what we would see the likes of IMF and the World Bank doing 20 years ago. They're basically building infrastructure through which these countries can get online and control it. So Facebook goes to a country like Brazil or a country like India, they make deals with local mobile operators, and they say, well, we'll get everybody online. And then there is a little footnote, and the footnote, if you read it closely, well, they'll get everybody online, but for free you'll only be able to access Facebook. And a few other sites, for everything else you'll have to pay. Right? And for me, it's a very good example of how once you put these companies in charge of advancing social welfare, you end up with very inferior types of social welfare. You cannot expect Google or Facebook or any of those firms to operate in the best interests of citizens and in the interests of actual people who want to get online. Of course, Facebook will say, oh, we're interested in digital inclusion. But they're interested in digital inclusion to the same extent as loan sharks are interested in financial inclusion. Yeah, they'll give you a loan, and they'll do their best to kick it out of you. And in the same way, Facebook will give you some internet access, and they will do its best to actually charge you either for the extra services or to suck out as much data as possible from you so that they can later monetize it. Right? And this is where I think we have to change something fundamental in how we view those companies. Because right now, and I often make this joke, but Silicon Valley is a Teflon industry. And what I mean by Teflon is that no matter how much dirt you throw at it, nothing sticks. Right? we never talk about big data in the same way as we talk about big oil or big food, right? And if you know, big pharma, right? Everybody knows that industries tend to have certain interests, they tend to organize themselves, and they tend to have agendas which very often contradict the public one. But that doesn't prevent us from rejecting, you know, nobody goes around and says that just because there are disorganized interests about food or about pharmaceuticals, we should all forget about health or forget about food. Like, nobody's saying that. I think the reason why these companies are so successful right now in the public debate is because every time you start questioning their political and economic power, the response that you hear immediately is that, oh, you must be hating technology, you must be hating science, you must be hating enlightenment, and you probably don't go to a dentist because you hate dentistry as well, right? And I think we have to change that. We have to be able to embrace technology, but we have to imagine technology as can be run by ourselves, citizens, governments, small nationalities, small communities, and so forth, and not just as operated by a few giant and mostly American corporations. If we manage to do that, we will be able to talk about big data as critically as we do when we talk about big pharma or big food. I think I'll end here, and maybe you can ask me something else. Thank you.